In this section of the course, I'm going to discuss how to edit your pet photos using your iPhone's Photos app. Photos is a built-in app native to all iPhone models. It's an app that allows you to store, organize, and edit your photos. It's worth noting that there are also third-party editing apps that you can use. The biggest competition for the Photos app is certainly Lightroom Photo Editor or Lightroom Mobile. This app can be found in the App Store and has a free and paid for subscription. Most of the tools that you would use as a beginner are available in the free version of the app. This allows you to store, organize, and edit photos, much like the Photos app, but it has the added step of importing photos unless you were to take photos using Lightroom's camera. Snapseed is another great all-rounder photo editing app. It doesn't allow you to store and organize photos as of right now, but it allows you to import photos and has a lot more advanced editing tools, a lot more control over the editing tools within it. VSCO, Darkroom, and Afterlight are other editing apps that not only allow you to edit your photos, but have some great filters and presets. If you're unhappy with the filters and presets found in the default Photos app, I would recommend downloading one of these three, using their filter, and then re-importing back into Photos and continuing your edit from there. It's worth mentioning that Lightroom Mobile has many advantages as an editing tool versus the Photos app. Overall, their tools just allow a lot more control over your images. There is, however, a much steeper learning curve to Lightroom, but the tone curve tool and the flexibility in color editing may just be worth the time it takes to learn the software. Lightroom Mobile is discussed in great length in our iPhone photo editing course on photographytips.com. If you're interested in learning Lightroom, I would highly recommend this course. In order to access the editing workspace within the Photos app, you can open any single image and tap the edit icon in the top toolbar. Once you do this, the editing tools are located in the bottom toolbar. You can scroll to reveal more tools. Once a tool is selected, a slider appears below that tool, which allows you to control that parameter. At the very bottom toolbar of the editing workspace, you can switch between three different sections. By default, you'll open into the Adjust section. To the right of this is the Filters or Presets section. To the far right is the Crop section. And if you're working on a live photo, there will be a fourth section to the far right, which allows you to select different moments of that live photo and select a new part to make your key photo. The first step of the editing process is selecting your image. Oftentimes you take loads of photos on your iPhone. You then have to sift through those images to find the best moments. Sometimes when you're shooting, you can pick out some moments that you think are the best images, but I highly recommend looking through all of the images that you took just in case maybe a moment just before or just after or an entirely different photo is better than the one that you thought was the best when you were taking your photos. Keep an open mind with your photography and look through all of your options. When I'm working with a large batch of images, I find it a good practice to take multiple passes at those images in order to slowly narrow down my choices by first selecting the images that are good that turned out from that session, then narrowing that down to what are the great or the best photos from that session. Favoriting your images by tapping the heart icon underneath the photo or separating it into different albums can help to separate which images are the good from the bad. Cropping is a very important process when editing. Cropping is essentially a second chance to recompose your image. Through cropping, much like composition, you can focus the viewer's attention exactly where you want it, refine the balance of your image and overall composition. Cropping distracting elements should be a main concern. When I crop, I'm typically scanning the edges of my frame and looking for little distracting elements that are peeking in that by cropping them out, I can make for a much more focused and isolated image. Rotation is a common secondary tool within the cropping section. Typically, you'll want to rotate your images to find a straight horizon. Finding the right amount of space around your subject in your crop can be a bit of a balancing act. best. A crop that's too tight or too open can add unnecessary tension or confusion for your viewer. We can also crop our images to different aspect ratios. This is a necessary process for certain mediums. With social media, the 1:1 or square aspect ratio is most popular, but many social media platforms are also now accepting 4:5 aspect ratios as well. The 9:16 aspect ratio is popular for social media story posts. The most common aspect ratios for print are 4:6, 5:7, and 8:10. Aspect ratios don't need to just be a utilitarian process. They can also be used as a creative process to give elements in your image more or less room to breathe. It's important to know that as we crop in, we lose resolution in our image. A 12 megapixel JPEG file, which our iPhones by default capture, doesn't leave you much room to actually crop in into your image. Cropping in this case should really just be used as a corrective tool because as you crop in, you significantly drop your resolution. Now I'll give you a brief overview of the cropping section in your Photos app. Again, by navigating over to the right icon in the bottom toolbar, you're going to open your cropping section. On the bottom, when you first open it, you can slide the slider to affect your rotation. The tool next to this is going to shift your vertical perspective. The tool next to that is going to shift your horizontal perspective. These vertical and horizontal perspective shifting tools probably won't come too much into play when taking photos of your pet, but the rotation tool is probably going to really help in getting those straight horizons out of your images. If we look to the top toolbar, the icon on the far left is going to flip your image horizontally. The icon to the right of that is going to rotate your image 90 degrees counterclockwise. The reset tool in the middle is going to reset your crop. The icon to the right of that is going to open your aspect ratio section. Along the bottom toolbar, we can switch between our freeform mode, which is going to allow us to crop freely. If we navigate to our original aspect ratio, you can see that by pulling in on our crop, we're now cropping uniformly to that 4:3 aspect ratio. Here, we can now switch between our vertical and horizontal aspect ratios at the click of a button. Then we can navigate to our square aspect ratio, wallpaper, 9:16, and we have many more aspect ratios following along this bottom toolbar. As you're cropping, you can either drag on one of these corners or you can pinch to zoom on your image and drag behind that cropping rectangle. Again, at any point in your cropping, you can tap the reset button to reset your crop. The tool next to the aspect ratio tool is our markup tool, which will allow us to mark up our image by drawing on it, something that isn't really necessarily used too much, and I won't go too much in depth. And then the three dots icon is going to allow us to copy our edits and then paste them to a different image. Continuing along with the editing processes, we're now going to discuss the exposure correction process. Adequate exposure is essential. Without exposure, without light, we simply don't have a photo. This is why exposure correction is such an important process in the editing process. A properly exposed image has adequate detail across highlights, midtones, and shadows. We can adjust our exposure to a certain extent in editing if the image wasn't taken properly or we just want to fine-tune our exposure. Slight under or overexposure can also work as a creative tool. Adjusting exposure with a JPEG image is quite limited. It's very hard to get any detail back in overexposed highlight. highlights. Underexposed shadows, on the other hand, can typically lend good results when brightening in editing. Because of this limitation, it's important to get exposure right in camera because we don't have too much leeway. Again, when you're exposing, you should be exposing for your highlights so that you can capture all that detail, since once lost, it's very hard to retrieve in editing. The two tools that can affect our exposure in photos are our exposure tool and our brightness tool. The exposure tool is going to brighten or darken the highlights predominantly in your image. On the other hand, the brightness tool is going to brighten the darker parts or the shadows in your image more predominantly. I've personally found that the exposure tool lends itself better to darkening photos, whereas the brightness tool lends itself better to brightening photos. The proper tool to use really depends on your photo, and usually when I'm adjusting exposure, I'm using both of these tools in conjunction. Dynamic range is the ratio between the brightest and darkest tones that a camera can capture in a single image. There's many tools in editing that can alter the perceived dynamic range of our images. A common process is to darken the highlights and brighten the shadows in editing in order to increase that perceived dynamic range. This is going to introduce more detail across the spectrum of highlights to shadows in your image. There's many tools in photos that can alter our dynamic range. The first one is brilliance, which attempts to do that process of darkening highlights and brightening shadows. By sliding to the right, you're going to increase that dynamic range. By sliding to the left, you're going to decrease that dynamic range. You can also do this manually by using the highlights tool, which targets the brightest parts of your image, and using the shadows tool, which targets the darker parts of your image. The contrast slider also plays a key role in introducing more or less detail in your image. And the black point tool targets the darkest parts of your image to make them either darker or a little bit faded and give your photo a more filmic look. The white balance editing process adjusts the color casts in your image. Generally speaking, you want the neutral parts in your image to appear neutral or the whites to appear white. With that being said, white balance can also be used as a creative tool. I'll commonly skew my images a little bit warmer under bright daylight and a little bit cooler under softer cloudy light. I find that this color cast generally just suits these different types of light a little bit better than just neutral. The best practice when correcting your white balance is to zoom into a neutral area of your image and use your warmth and tint tools to adjust that area until it appears neutral. Then you can zoom back out to the whole image and make minor adjustments to where the whole image appears white balanced. There are two tools that affect your white balance within photos. The first one is the warmth tool, which will add either a yellow or a blue cast to your image. And then we have the tint tool, which adds either a green or magenta cast to your image. The color correction process is a process of adjusting the colors in your image so that they appear natural. You can certainly also use color correction tools to give your images a more surreal look. However, over or under saturation should be done with caution, especially when we're talking about pet photography. You probably want the color of their fur to appear natural looking. The tools in photos that affect our colors are saturation and vibrance. Saturation is going to globally adjust the saturation of the colors in your image. Vibrance, on the other hand, is going to adjust just the colors that appear undersaturated, and it's going to protect the skin tones or the oranges, reds, yellows in your image. It's worth noting that white balance and contrast also play a key role in getting accurate colors out of your images. Black and white processing can be a great creative way to take your pet photography. With black and white images, you're putting a lot more focus on the light that you capture in your image by excluding color. This means that contrast and dynamic range can be explored a lot further. Black and white processing can sometimes be the remedy to a cluttered image where You have distracting elements in the background. By reducing everything to gray tone, you can really focus the attention back on your subject. Black and white processing can also create a moodier or more dramatic looking image. Natural light is a beautiful form of light, but it doesn't always cooperate. If you're stuck with overcast and dull or bright and harsh light, no need to fear. Contrast is here. Contrast can work wonders in these situations. If your light is too dull, increase the contrast to separate your elements in your image. If your light is too harsh, decrease the contrast to introduce more detail back into your shadows and highlights. Filters and presets are probably the most popular form of editing. They are essentially pre-made editing templates. When selecting a preset to use, pay attention to the way that it affects not only your light, but especially the colors in your image. I personally find that light I can adjust after applying a filter, but color can sometimes be a little bit trickier to work with, especially in the Photos app where you don't have much control over the color. Filters and presets will commonly need to be fine-tuned for each image. Often filters are designed to be a little bit extreme so that you have the flexibility to dial it down and blend it into your image. Many editing programs will allow you to scale the intensity of the filter, and this is a great practice. Filters and presets are a great place to start your edit, but they are certainly not the only thing that you should be doing in your editing process. The Photos app has 9 built-in filters to apply to your images. 6 are color filters and 3 are black and white filters. Lastly, we'll discuss the editing approach. First, you need to know your tools. By understanding what each of these tools does, you'll be able to creative problem solve when you have issues with your imagery. Have a direction before you start your edit so that you know what you need to do to that image and ultimately where you want to take that image. Editing is not a linear process. It's great to think about it as a process of problem solving. Identify a problem and fix that first, and that's commonly going to lead you to another problem that you want to fix and another, until ultimately your image is problem-free. Editing is largely intuitive and requires a certain amount of taste. You need to know when to stop an edit or when an edit has gone too far and you need to start to dial it back. When editing an image in Photos, a great practice every once in a while is to simply tap on the screen, and that's going to show you the original image before you applied your edits. With this particular image, we can see that I have gone way too far with it. So I can start to bring down my contrast. I see that I've brightened the shadows a bit too much. I can bring that back down. Already the image is starting to look a lot better. And by doing this process of resetting your image back to how it was and then continuing your editing, you're making sure that you're not going too far. Editing is best used in moderation. Generally speaking, it's great to strive for an edit where people aren't even aware that you edited the photo in the first place. A great way to develop taste for editing is by studying photography. Instagram, Flickr, Pinterest are all great resources for doing just that. On this slide, we can see a roundup of all of the key concepts that we've discussed in this section. Again, this is a great slide to print out as a resource to guide you while you're editing your pet photos. In the next section of this course, we're going to wrap up all of the key concepts that we've discussed. I'll bring your attention back to the most important ideas that you should be leaving this course thinking about in order to get the best out of your pet photos on your iPhone.